it's possible, right? It's not an impossibility to be an ethical leader. So this idea that you have to be the courageous leader who sacrifices individuals and makes people's lives, a small number of people's lives horrible so that we can make more money or make other people's lives better is a false choice.
Can you achieve extraordinary results while making the world a better place? I'm Bruce Temkin, and together we'll explore how. Welcome to Humanity at Scale, Redefining Leadership podcast. Join me as I speak with visionary leaders and top experts to uncover the secrets of humanity-centric leadership. Ready to rethink leadership? Let's dive in. Welcome back to Humanity at Scale. Leadership always sounds straightforward until you have one of those moments where pressure rises, time feels tight, and every option has a trade-off. And it brings up a question that sits at the center of today's episode, not just about leadership, but about ethical leadership in particular. When everything is at stake, when survival pushes us to make tough calls, how do leaders stay human? That's the question we'll examine in today's episode, and there's no one better to explore it with than my guest. John Katsos has spent his entire career working inside of those moments. He's worked in places like Iraq, Ukraine, and Lebanon, helping leaders navigate fragile systems, make decisions under intense pressure, and understand how business can become a stabilizing force in the middle of crisis. He's editor-in-chief of Society and Business Review, co-author of Ethical Leadership in Conflict and Crisis, and a nominee for the 2024 and 2025 Nobel Peace Prize. His work shows that even in the harshest environments, organizations can rebuild trust, strengthen communities, and promote peace. John, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Bruce, for having me.
Cool. So you have an amazing background, but maybe for our audience, if we can start with, what do you do on a day-to-day basis, and how do you describe your role to the people you know and the rest of the world?
Again, thanks for having me. I am a professor of management strategy and entrepreneurship at the American University of Sharjah. On a day-to-day basis, I'm usually either teaching or doing some part of a research project. So right now, my main research project is sort of a 7-country case study that I'm doing with my co-author for the book, Jason McLean, and a few other scholars around the world. And so a lot of that is just doing pieces at a time. So I was just in Warsaw to interview people for a part on Ukraine, which is one of our case studies. And the people I interview tend to be business executives. So the leaders that I focus on are from the business community, and they tend to be C-suite leaders. So CEOs, CFOs, COOs, and a lot of the questions that I ask them are things that are interesting to me, but then are also things that I try to bring back into conversations with my students, particularly with our master's level students. They want to know, right, similar to your audience, how people can even make anything work in these contexts, because they seem so difficult and so daunting for those of us who are in just more stable environments. And I think learning from them is key, right? So learning from these executives means that when you're facing difficulties, even though those difficulties might not be quite as extreme, you can hopefully take some of the same lessons out of it.
Great. Now, when most people picture crisis, they imagine chaos, right? Systems breaking, decisions under pressure, moral gray zones. But for you, crisis isn't just stress, right? It sounds like it's a laboratory for understanding ethics and humanity. So I'd love to start with a little bit of your story behind that calling, because you were a lawyer, right? Not all lawyers go and do this. So what first drew you towards studying leadership in conflict and crisis zones? And can you share a specific moment when it really became personal for you?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was largely accidental, to be honest. So I knew I was a religion major in my bachelor's degree, which is at Haverford College, and I knew I wanted to go to law school. And about a year into law school, the financial system collapsed. So the whole thing, the bottom dropped out of it, and I realized in talking to my colleagues who were leaving, who were trying to get jobs, who were just a little bit older than me, that yeah, that jobs were not going to be easy to come by, and that the best thing I could do would be to delay. And so I tacked on an extra master's degree for whatever for that reason. And I say that because what that meant was I interacted with a gentleman named Tim Ford, who was the only person who taught both in the law school and the business school at GW, which is where I was studying. And Tim is kind of the godfather of this research area of business and peace. And we started having just very friendly conversations that then became more serious conversations. Some of them started out with conversations just about how businesses operate, how they stay ethical, and then became more serious in the sense that I think both of us are, at least I at the time, and then I sort of went into flux and then came back to it. I was very serious about my faith, and I didn't really know what that meant in the context of sort of the real world and working. And talking to Tim, what it made me realize was that there was this path where there were businesses trying to do good things, and often in the worst places and in the worst types of environments, in the places where you would assume people would sort of suspend their ethical judgment. And as a result of that, I got a chance to interact with another professor when I was there, John Forer, and he just happened to be going to Cyprus. So I'm a child of Greek immigrants, and so that meant that I had Greek language skills, and so I jumped on this trip with Professor Forer to kind of help him out and try to negotiate um, some of the entrances into businesses and try to establish contacts and networks. And I just sort of got hooked. It was great talking to businesses. It was great talking to executives. It was great talking to leaders, and just hearing what they had to say, and then being able to be a conduit for what they were saying to people who could actually use their advice. So it wasn't just PR, it wasn't just marketing. It was, we're taking these lessons, we're giving them to academics, which helps. It helps them develop different models, but then we're also giving it to students who are the next generation of leaders, for them to be able to go out and use these same lessons. And I saw it very much immediately, because even in Cyprus, we had master students with us, so they were able to see directly what the connections were between what they were hearing from these executives and what they would be able to do back home. And that was sort of it for me. I mean, once I had that experience, I knew this was what I wanted to do for the time being. And I haven't lost that yet. Maybe someday I will. But so far
Hopefully
that's
not.
been the part.
Hopefully not.
Hopefully not. But it's taken me to all these places, right? So it's taken me to just different places to be able to talk to executives working in Iraq, working in Syria, working in Sri Lanka, working in Ukraine, um, just doing incredible things in these places. It's also exposed me to a lot of terrible things, right? So you do see the worst part of people in those places, but there are people trying to make things work in a good way.
Well, I'd love to hear, start with some of the good stuff. When you go to places like Iraq, or Lebanon, and Ukraine that are, centers of crisis, I'm sure you ran across some leaders that surprised you in some way, in terms of the way they were making decisions and the way they were sort of handling themselves. Could you share a story or two about leaders that really influenced sort of your thinking about what leadership should look like?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I'd say the person who had the most influence in that direction was a gentleman by the name of Merrill Fernando. So I met Merrill in 2015. He was receiving an award for some of the work that he had done in Sri Lanka, which is where he's from, or where he was from. It also happened to be his 90th birthday. So that gives you a sense of like how old he was. But he was in great shape. I mean, he just passed away a few years ago, and he was at 90 and just great shape. And he founded a company called Dilma Tea, which some people maybe have heard of, in the middle of the Sri Lankan Civil War. So not the time when you would think that there was sort of a booming ecosystem of entrepreneurship. He had trained as a tea master under the British when Sri Lanka had been Ceylon, when it had been a colonial sort of outpost, and had studied in the UK, studied being a tea master, had kind of been brought up in that tea industry that was still very colonial even after Sri Lanka became independent, and just was able to communicate um, both how difficult it was, right? There were great difficulties in him starting the company, in getting threats from rebel groups, in having threat to the supplies, in dealing with things like the tsunami in the early 2000s, right? Like just in dealing with problem after problem after problem. And he was able to communicate that, but also in a way that just reflected this positivity and enthusiasm about being able to be a key part of society. So he's someone who it was obvious loved his home, loved Sri Lanka, loved the people, and loved tea, right? Really loved what he was doing, and didn't see these as being mutually exclusive. And so it meant that when we had conversations, it could go away very quickly. We could have these very deep conversations because he was able to again be both very positive and still very clear eyed about the difficulties.
That's interesting because it sounds like a piece of what happens for leaders in these deeply conflicted environments is they separate themselves from that conflict to stay positive, right? To find a positive self and stay energized. But you also said they stay realistically connected to the crisis around them. Um, how does a leader do that? How does a leader both sort of keep the company and the vision going forward while still acknowledging but not getting sort of thrown to the side by the conflict that surrounds them?
I think what I've noticed is the executives who I've spoken to who I would call sort of the more successful ones. So the ones who've been able to keep their heads, but also, run their companies and do it well, are the ones who figure out what works for them. So I think one of the lessons I've taken out is there is no one size fits all in terms of how you mentally process some of the difficulties that you see. Um, Everyone I've spoken to in those spaces has seen some sort of horrible thing, usually repeatedly. And so I'm thinking about the folks who I was just interviewing in Ukraine, and yeah, I mean the things they describe, the types of experiences they describe, the types of difficulties they've had in their companies, whether it's having their employees get killed, having to evacuate facilities, having their facilities that they've built over years and years be destroyed, um, having to having employees be recruited to the front. I mean, so the very difficult situations. And yet I think when you talk to them, you realize they all use different mechanisms, some of which are healthy and some of which are not, if I'm being fair. So you notice, I think over time that there's some people who have very unhealthy coping mechanisms that if I were to go back and talk to them, and in some cases I have, you see that it catches up with them. But then I think the ones, and I put Merrill in this category and sort of a fair number of others, the ones who are successful and also able to keep their heads are the ones that have figured out how they themselves work. So they know themselves extremely well. They know when they're getting overwhelmed. They know when they're having stress responses. I don't know that they would describe it this way. But from the outside, it becomes clear that that's what's taking place, right? They're able to process how they're able to process information, if that makes sense. So for some people, that means being rooted in faith traditions. For some people, that means being rooted in family. For some people, that means having a super intense exercise regime. So like everyone, I think, has their own way of grounding themselves for themselves, and then that's where it starts. So I think the folks who figure out whatever way works for them then have some very similar ways of engaging with other people. So they're able to maintain empathy with others. I think the ones who are successful walk around a lot. So as leaders, they walk, they talk. They're always enthusiastic about what they're doing. They're positive. They understand that people are looking to them as leaders to guide them. And so they're not afraid to go from the strategic level in the boardroom to the shop floor. They're not afraid to go out in the fields and, in Merrill's case, be out in tea fields. In the case of executives in Ukraine, be out in factories, right, and really talk to people and see the issues that they're facing, and also get to know them. Just really have these personal, very human relationships, and not just see them as human resources, but see them as human.
Cool. Well, I'd love to dig a little bit more into like your interviews in Ukraine. I'm a
Sure.
quarter Ukrainian,
Okay.
so always interested in that. But I imagine
Yeah.
for most people, when we think about Ukraine, we think about war. We don't think about the fact that there are businesses still
Yeah.
operating, still running. What was that like, finding leaders who are, probably operating in some cases as if there isn't a war around them? What's it like running a business? What did you find it's like running a business in the middle of Ukraine right now?
Yeah, so I think there was a transition period. So I think most businesses were caught totally unaware by the events of 2022, and there was a period of maybe a year where companies were really just trying to get their footing. It wasn't a situation like Lebanon, where Lebanon has been in almost constant crisis since about 2004, and people have created this sort of culture of resilience. In Ukraine, it was a shock, right? And so, in spite of the fact that the eastern portions of Ukraine, there had been conflict since 2014, it wasn't the same. It hit home very very differently. After that, so in that period, right? So in that period, I think what you saw is there was a priority on safety. So almost every executive I talked to during that first 9 months or so talked about how it was first safety of personnel, then safety of facilities, where and when possible, right? People really had that very large focus on that. And then it was issues that they didn't think of as being priorities beforehand, right? So logistics became a big problem. So not only how do you get things in, but how do you get things out, right? So if you're an export-oriented company, how do you ship out to clients who you have multi-year contracts with? If you are, I had one IT company who a large chunk of their workforce they had evacuated out to Poland, but a portion of the workforce they had kept inside Ukraine, and they were trying to source like basic parts, like keyboards, right? They're trying in the early stages. It was so unknown. It wasn't clear who was coming in, who was going out, how they were going to be able to go, what was going to be targeted and what wasn't. All of that was sort of unknown. I think since then, what's happened is there have been phases of the war in which um, the Ukrainians have done something remarkable, which is every time it shifts, right? So every time, let's say, the energy infrastructure gets targeted, every time civilian infrastructure gets targeted or rail gets targeted, they adjust very quickly. And I think one of the reasons they're able to adjust so quickly is now they're almost not surprised by anything. So they are in this mindset of assuming the worst and then building resilience for it through that. And that's meant cooperating with competitors. So that's something we hear a lot in crisis and conflict context, but especially in Ukraine. So a fairly typical example will be um, competitors will have different aspects of some fundamental need that's required, right? Some fundamental resource. So it could be something like fuel. There's like regular fuel shortages. And so you'll have situations where competitors are sharing fuel, which is in a non-crisis context is madness. But in this context, it makes sense because one person might have it now, but not have it later. And you might have it later. And so you're willing to share in these contexts because you understand that everyone might be in this situation somewhere down the line. And so you're willing to help each other out.
Wow. So I'd love to take this theme about crisis because I think that's sort of a core of some of your work, right? When crisis hits, like leaders almost never have the luxury of time. Decisions happen fast in
Yeah.
fog and ambiguity, right? And those choices define legacies in the end, legacy who they are. Your work examines what ethics looks like when the usual playbooks break down. So I'd love to just start with when you think about, you know, ethics and leading in a crisis, what is the framework or frameworks that work for your mind and that you want leaders to think about when they're in those modes?
I get this question from leaders a lot, actually. And I'd say the first thing is to essentially forget about trying to ask the lawyers. So as a lawyer, I feel like I can say this. Often, what happens in crisis and conflict context is companies, especially big multinationals, they default to how do I make sure I don't get in trouble for anything I do there, and that ends up being a disaster. Those are sort of the last people you check with rather than the first people. Instead, the most important thing is to know what the values of you and the organization are. So many companies that tell us, and I say us because there's sort of a research network of us that work on these issues. So many people tell us about when they reflect on things that didn't go well, that really the issue was they didn't know what they stood for. They didn't know what they stood for. They didn't know what the company stood for, or they knew what they as individuals stood for, but they didn't know if the company actually stood for that. And so often that's the ethical issues of the companies that we see who go off the rails are the ones that don't have any clarity as to their vision and their values. They have a sense that they want to make money and that there's a way to make money, but they don't always have a sense of the how, and what they're morally willing to trade or give up to make that happen. That tends to be a really strong clarifying lens for people. So again, that's why I think the leaders who I've seen who make it work are the ones who again know themselves and have something to ground them, as individuals. Again, that could be their faith, it could be their family, it could be their local community. There's usually something that ties them, that roots them, that makes them essentially who they are, and also that creates their ethical lens and allows them to very quickly decide whether something's right or not and be committed to that. So not just talking about being a Muslim, a Christian, a Buddhist, whatever, right? But really understanding what that means. And then when you're faced with something that doesn't meet those criteria, saying, no, we don't do that, right? Not, I don't do that, but we don't do that. That's just not a thing that we're going to do. It's not an option that we're even going to consider. That tends to be the way it starts. That then leads to things like community building. So people engaging with their competitors, people making sure that they know who matters in the community, and taking care of even those people who don't matter. And then going beyond that, right, making sure that you're doing something that again seems sort of counterintuitive, but really helps in crisis, which is to take stands. So in a lot of crisis contexts, businesses will say things like, well, we're trying to stay neutral. And what they really mean is that they want to be impartial. They want to continue to provide services to everybody, right? So very much like an aid agency, like the Red Cross. They want to say to everybody, look, we're going to still provide you with motorcycle repair services or food or whatever it is that you sell. But that doesn't mean you can be neutral. And we found that in crisis context, you can't really be neutral, because things are so polarized, usually in crisis contexts, that if you don't pick a side will be picked for you. And it's usually better to pick the side that you actually support and then make clear that you're still impartial with respect to the business that you conduct, than it is to be painted into a corner, and be told what side you're on. That's usually a situation where companies end up making poor choices.
It's interesting. So it's as if when we talk about ethics, right, there is no sort of ethical baseline for people. Ethics, it sounds like so we talk about are based on your personal values, right? So your organizational values. So it could be that a leadership team on one company does something completely different, looks completely antithetical to what another leadership team is doing, but they can both be ethical, right? If they
Yes.
both have values. How do you reconcile the fact that at least from what I'm hearing, there is no baseline of what good ethical leadership is because it's based on the foundation of your individual values?
Yeah. So I think what's interesting is you find, and this is a lot of the work that my mentor, Tim Fort, has done, is what you find is that people will come to the same conclusions from different paths. So very often what you see is that people have a fundamental sense, people who are rooted in sort of their ethics, and trying to make ethical decisions. People are rooted in a sense of justice. They're rooted in a sense of people's rights and making sure that, like, understanding that people have rights and that they're human beings. And when they make unethical decisions, it's usually because they're forgetting about human beings. It's often that they lose sight of their sort of their fellow humans' humanity, and don't think about or choose to ignore, which is usually what it is, choose to ignore the humanity of others, and the impact that their actions will have on others. I will say, there are situations where I've talked to executives where it seems that they honestly don't know or did not know the impact that they were having on people. But then there's lots of cases where sometimes people will say they didn't know, but you sort of, if you ask enough prying questions, you realize, no, they must have known. There's no way they couldn't have known. I think it's hard um, to make these kind of ethical decisions because most of us are unwilling. Maybe not most of us. That's not right. Many of us are unwilling to call people out on what we think is unethical because other people might not like us if we say it, right? So there's a people pleasing aspect to it, and I think the leaders who operate best in crisis are the ones who really just don't care about that. They don't care all that much about how they're going to be perceived of. Instead, they care about doing the right thing, and then we can shape perceptions around that later. So it's not that they're not engaged in marketing and not engaged in PR; they are. Um, but there's definitely a mindset of let's do the right thing. Let's figure out what the right thing is. Let's do it, and then we shape the narrative how we need to shape the narrative to make that to make it as non to make it not impact the business as much as we can, and maybe even be a positive.
If you're enjoying this episode, make sure to follow or subscribe so you never miss a conversation. We've got plenty more great stories coming your way. I love the point that you made that you have to pick a side, and otherwise a side is picked for you, especially in highly polarized environments. I look at things that like bounce around. Like let's take the notion of woke. I wrote about woke uh, a couple months ago where I said it was polarized from both sides, right? Early on, the left said if you're not woke enough, then you have a real problem and you don't deserve anything in the world. And then the right said everyone's too woke and you don't deserve anything. So where you have these polarized views that can bounce around in public perception, how does a leader take a stand and hold it when it seems like the world is bouncing back and forth in terms of its perception of a topic or of an issue?
I think, yeah, it's a great example, and we've had a lot of I've had a lot of requests from U.S. companies saying like, well, how do we do this? And almost getting upset, like, well, no, if we pick a side, then we're going to get demonized by the other side, and they're going to be really upset at us. And my response to that is, well, you're going to get demonized anyway. In these highly polarized environments, what happens is you're with us or you're against us. And so in these sorts of contexts where if we take this or the conversation around DEI, what makes a company look bad is to take on DEI when it doesn't believe in it and then reject it the moment that it becomes politically unpopular. That's what's going to make a company look bad. If you say, no, this is something we're committed to, right? Like we're into this. We believe in it. We're for it. And then when you get pressure on it, you say, well, I don't care if you put pressure on me. I'm going to double down on it. This is something I care about. Two things happen. So first, the people who are on your side are going to look to you and be even more supportive. But then second, you will remarkably get grudging respect from the opposition. So I think what you saw in sort of the early days of the Trump administration is the Trump administration going after the organizations that it understood would change course when put under pressure, rather than going after those organizations that it knew would fight it, tooth and nail, would bring it to court, would pay the lawyers, would do all that. That means you have a level of protection by being willing to fight for what you believe in. But that's not something that most Americans in particular, but just more generally, the sort of folks in the West are used to, because in the past you're used to saying, well, you go with the flow, you go with whatever the mindset is at the time, and you hope things work out, and sort of make the best decision that you can at the moment. I think we're getting to a point where, or I think we've gotten to a point already where you have to decide what you actually think about these things, both individually and as an organization. And hopefully those two align. If they don't, you should probably find another job, and then make sure that you're committed to it, and you stick with it because it's something that you care about.
So, and I love that. I mean, one of the things that I've always pushed is the notion of values
Yes.
from leadership, right? And what you're saying there is, if you don't have clarity around your values and you do something, then you don't understand whether that thing is worth fighting for or protecting,
Yeah.
because it's not connected to anything real. Um, and so, if you think about the world we live in that has increasing conflict, right? Or let me ask the question: do you think the world we're living in is going to have increasing conflict, and conflict will be more of the norm? And if so, how should leaders think about leading differently in the future where conflict is the norm?
Yeah, so I think there's three things happening simultaneously. It's something Jason and I talk about in the book a bit, that seem to indicate that things will get worse before they get better. The first is globalization. So we're all interconnected in ways we weren't 20, 50, 100 years ago. I had a great chat with my master's students just the other day about how 100 years ago, for people to care so much about things that happen on the opposite end of the earth, the way that people, especially my students, care so much about Palestine, it would take months, years for people to establish that kind of sense of something that was going on far away. They would need newspaper articles and books. And now, very quickly, conversations can be galvanized about things that are happening on the other side of the world. That's new. And it's new also that we're so interconnected in terms of trade, in terms of finance. So between the US dollar on the finance side, and then just the fact that every single item in our homes and our offices, everything that we see has been to probably a dozen different countries before it ever gets to us, means that we're interconnected in ways that we don't even fully appreciate. The second factor is climate change. So I'm not known as being an alarmist with respect to climate change. I think you can both say the climate is changing and also say we don't know what that means, and so we know it's going to mean more natural disasters and worse natural disasters. We know it's going to mean people finding their natural environments much less hospitable and much different than they have in the past. And that's going to make competitions for resources and stressors on places that often have too many people in the first place much more difficult. And then the third is inequality. So, and by inequality, I don't mean, sometimes we get really fixated on sort of rich poor, and that's not really the inequality that drives conflict. The inequality that drives conflict is when a certain group is richer systematically than another group. And we're seeing that play out at a country level, at a regional level, at a global level, that certain groups systematically have more than others. And now, because of globalization, it's much more widespread, that knowledge. And then because of climate change, the people who are less likely to be able to be resilient in the face of climate change are also the ones who have been the most systematically short-shrifted over the last 50, 100,000 years, whatever you want to call it. Those three things operating, one of those things by themselves would probably not be enough to push us in a particular direction. All three of those things happening at the same time means that crisis isn't going anywhere anytime soon. And we're just going to have overlapping sort of crisis after crisis after crisis. But we're humans, so we're very good at adjusting to whatever the new normal is.
So interesting. When you talk about the Ukraine example of competitors helping each other, right? And it seems like the world, we come together during some crisis, right? The crisis pushes us there. In a world where we're ongoing crisis and it's persistent, do you think that collective goodwill will continue? Like, how much longer will Ukrainian competitors continue to help each other, right? Is that a sustainable model? If we just maybe we go crisis to crisis, and that's where our humanity comes out, and then we forget about humanity after that?
I think nothing helps clarify where you stand quite as much as a crisis. And I think in the Ukrainian context, it's about having a very clear enemy. I think the difficulty in the U.S. context, one of the difficulties is something we see a lot in Civil War contexts, which is it's not always clear who the enemy is. So Lebanon's a great example. It's not always clear who the enemy is in Lebanon. You can ask people, and they might tell you, different things to different people, but then the same person might tell you two different things in the same day about who's the problem, right? Who's the source of the issue? who's the one that really is driving it, so that we need to come together against that person or that group or um, that thing, right? So in natural disasters, this tends to be a bit easier because, okay, you blame a giant wave, right, or a hurricane or something like that. It's not a human being, or a set of human beings, and so in some ways, it forces us to come together and appreciate the fact that we're nothing compared to the strength of Mother Nature. In war contexts, it's tricky because on the one hand, it brings people together, but there's an enemy, and so then you have to figure out ways. And I think the best companies and the best leaders have been able to do this. Figure out ways to, once conflict ends, turn those enemies into friends, or at least turn those enemies into people who you won't be violent with again, and whose humanity you can see. Again, I think the best leaders are able to do that. They're able to flick a switch is maybe too quick, but they're able to adjust based on new information very quickly. So be able to say, yeah, that was the case in the past, but we have the same ethics, we have the same mental model, and now the situation has changed. And so these people who were our enemies yesterday, today are people who need our help, and who are people who are willing to help. It's again, the best leaders have that. I think have that ability, but it's rooted in their individuality and their individual understanding of what their ethics are and clarity about what those ethics are. It doesn't always mean the same action though. So the ethics might be the same, but the actions could be totally different from one day to the next because the situation changed.
So if we think about this sort of this future of crises and how you might deal with them, if you were designing a leadership training or ethical governance system for the future, what would it include that today's systems don't?
Luckily, I do this, and so I can tell you like some of the things that we do in our leadership training. One of the big things is teaching people how to engage in conflict resolution. So teaching leaders how to negotiate, teaching them how to understand other people, what things are okay, what things are not, how they're perceived of and how they're not. The second is individual sort of stock taking. So figuring out, often I'll do an exercise with my executive students called giving voice to values, which a lot of MBA professors will do as well. The idea being that leaders are trying to get in touch with what they actually believe in and figure out where those red lines are for them, and then try to understand what that means in practice. So often at the strategic level, we're not seeing the implications of what we're doing at the operational, the tactical levels. And having a really clear idea as to what your own personal values and ethics are helps in a lot of ways. One of the big ways is understanding those dynamics and where there might be unethical, unintended consequences of strategic decisions. And so really helping leaders understand themselves. And then the second component of that is helping leaders understand when their organization's values don't align with their own and what to do about it. So training them on, when to know to leave. That is actually a big part of that conversation. But then also training them about how much impact leaders have on corporate culture and on the values of the organizations that they lead, and instructing them on how to do that, right? How do you set a corporate culture that values people's humanity? If you have a company where it seems to be sort of agnostic with respect to people's rights, but you as an individual care a lot about people's human rights, how do you shift the organization in that direction, which is your job as a leader, right? It's to captain the ship as you best are able to do so, unless and until your supervisors take you out of that role, right? So until someone tells you, no, you can't do that anymore. And if you're pushing your values and they're not in alignment, you'll know pretty fast. And leaders have told us this, right? That yeah, I had this set of ethical models. My company had this one. It didn't work out, and then I was gone, right? Or it didn't work out, and I got resistance from employees, or I got resistance from managers. And again, I think the leaders who are best equipped to deal with that are the ones who say, well, okay, this is where I'm coming from. Here are my values, and then be able to have a conversation with other people and help them understand what they believe in beyond just sort of gut reactions to things.
Cool. So I think we'll end the conversation there and go to my final questions, because I think that the lessons for leaders are clear, and that's what I want to have everyone really focus on. How do you as leaders actually lead in a more ethical way? And it sounds like there's a lot on values, there's a lot on understanding how to change culture. And also, I love the part, how do you negotiate? How do you interact with people? So I'm going to ask you a set of questions I ask all of my guests. The first one is, what's one leadership skill you think will become even more important in the future?
Being able to talk about your values in a way that is non-threatening to people who don't share those values.
Oh, I love that.
So like I'm an Orthodox Christian. Being able to talk and have a conversation about the things that are important to me, and without being threatening to other people, and with also understanding that the moment you say certain words, right, the moment you bring up religion, a lot of people get very uncomfortable, or some people get comfortable so long as it's their religion. But if it's not their religion, they suddenly get uncomfortable. I think leaders are going to have to be able to have those conversations in ways that are empathetic, in ways that are open, and in ways that help other people to express themselves similarly in non-threatening ways.
That's a great one. The second question is, if you could wave a magic wand and immediately make organizations more humanity centric, what would you change?
I would say having everyone being able to actually, and by everyone I mean every employee being able to really contribute to decision making. That doesn't mean making the decision, because only one person can really make decisions in certain contexts, right? The leader has to still lead, but if every organization were to really listen to all the people who are part of that organization, they would be very different places.
Great. And what's one final piece of advice you'd like to leave with our listeners?
It's possible, right? It's not an impossibility to be an ethical leader. So this idea that you have to be the courageous leader who sacrifices individuals and makes people's lives, a small number of people's lives horrible so that we can make more money or make other people's lives better, is a false choice. The real choice is about whether you're going to be able to look yourself in the mirror or not, and whether you'll follow through on what you believe.
It's interesting. One of the things, and I love that. One of the things that I oftentimes talk about is future self accountability. Right? Are you doing the things today that at some point in the future, when you look back, are you going to say, "I'm proud of what I did," or are you going to have your future self look back at you and say, "Who was that person?"
Right.
Right? And have all
Right.
that
Right. Right.
regret.
Absolutely.
Awesome, awesome. Now, this has been great, but where can
Yes.
people follow your work and go deeper for your ideas if they want to learn more and sort of just consume more of the research and the content you're providing?
Yeah, best thing to do is to follow me on LinkedIn. So that's where all my research work always gets posted up there, and I also link to a lot of other people who do work in the same space. I'm not really on any other social media, but LinkedIn tends to be the best way to do it, and you're welcome to follow me.
Awesome. Thank you, John.
Thanks so much, Bruce. Thank you.
Well, everyone, I hope you enjoyed our conversation today. Now let's dive into the after show, a segment where I'll reflect on the key takeaways from this episode. Welcome to the after show. As I listened back to this conversation with John, what really struck me is how much leadership in crisis zones teaches us about leadership everywhere. He's talking to CEOs in Ukraine, Sri Lanka, Iraq, places facing enormous strain. But the patterns he described apply to any leader dealing with uncertainty, pressure, or constant change. And that's becoming most of us. A few things stood out that I think are worth carrying forward. The first is that values have to be clear long before the pressure hits. John talked about leaders who struggled because they couldn't articulate what they or their companies actually stood for. The leaders who held up didn't need a memo or a meeting. Their values gave them immediate direction. The second point is that self-awareness is what keeps leaders steady under strain. He described executives who stayed functional in the hardest moments because they understood their own stress response and coping mechanisms. They weren't all using the same tools, but they knew themselves well enough to manage themselves. The third point is that staying close to people builds better judgment. The leaders John admired didn't hide in conference rooms. They walked the floors, visited sites, talked to employees, and built real relationships. That proximity gave them a more accurate picture of what was happening and helped maintain trust. The fourth point is that neutrality is usually a liability in polarized environments. John made a strong point. If you don't choose a side will be chosen for you. Leaders who anchored themselves in real values and stayed consistent, even when the pressure rose, earned credibility on all sides. And the last point is that crisis exposes your real culture instantly. His examples from Ukraine, competitors sharing fuel, teams reorganizing overnight, weren't spontaneous acts. They reflected cultures that had already valued community and resilience. Crisis just made those qualities visible. What struck me is how universal John's lessons were. He was talking about extreme environments, but the behaviors he highlighted are the same ones that matter when any leader's world starts to wobble. So here are 2 questions worth thinking about as you reflect on this episode. The first, under real pressure, what truth about you would your decisions reveal? And the second question, would your team trust that your values will hold when things get tough? I hope you enjoyed this episode, and remember, you are the flame that can spark humanity at scale. One decision, one conversation, one moment at a time. Thanks for tuning in to Humanity at Scale, Redefining Leadership podcast. Remember, true leadership isn't only about achieving short-term results. It's about creating a lasting, positive impact on all of the people you touch. Join me next time as we uncover more insights and strategies for humanity-centric leadership. Until then, I'm Bruce Temkin, encouraging you to lead with purpose and empathy and to be the spark that elevates humanity at scale.